Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. I'm joined today by Professor Kyle Harper, who is the writer of a terrific book, The Fate of Rome. And he's Professor of Classics and Letters at the University of Oklahoma. So welcome, Kyle, to the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me.
Okay, so your book is a story of the fall of Rome, which is an absolutely massive subject. I don't know how many volumes it took Gibbon to tell it, but it's absolutely huge. But the subtitle of your book is Climate, Disease, and the End of an Empire. And I think that sort of sets out quite clearly which bit of the story that you concentrate on in your book. It's a massive subject, and I was pondering how best to get into it. And I thought maybe we could kick off by looking at the year 400, because at that stage, maybe things aren't going too badly for the Romans.
Right. I mean, I think you're absolutely correct that this is a huge theme, and it's a very well-trod route. We've no shortage of historical scholarship on something as grand and captivating as the fall of the Roman Empire. And Gibbon, it took him 6 volumes, 6 very big volumes, to tell the story of decline and fall, and it stretches for over a millennium too. So he certainly indulged in a wide view that's still amazing to read and beautifully written, but also insightful. And you've asked about a very particular moment in the very long phenomenon of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And around 400, the world, if you're the Romans, is maybe a little tense because the eastern and western halves of the empire are feuding and struggling for control of armies and territories, while Rome's enemies gather both within the borders of the empire, but also beyond it. And this is a period of the Roman Empire, the later Roman Empire, that I think over the last generation or so, we've really come to appreciate how robust the recovery was. And really in all dimensions, demographically, the population had started to grow again. Economically, towns and trade. The world of 400 is still quite an urbanized world by the standards of an ancient society, with massive cities like Rome and Constantinople, but also Antioch and Alexandria and Carthage. And then with a lot of mid-sized towns like London that were all over the empire, and sort of the network that made the Roman Empire what it was. So in 400, the Romans would have still seemed like the dominant superpower. And I think it's fairly hard for them to imagine what came next. And that's one of the challenges for us as historians, is not to abuse the privileges of hindsight and assume that history had to be the way it was. This was still quite a powerful empire, and the events that unfolded over the subsequent decades were surprising and traumatizing for the people who lived through it.
So that's 400. So let's jump forward, I guess, 140 years to the reign of Justinian. So at that stage, the empire in the West, right, it's pretty much collapsed. But in the East, where Justinian reigns, I mean, this is still the Roman Empire, right?
It's absolutely still the Roman Empire. They certainly call themselves the Romans, at least through the first half of Justinian's reign. Latin is still even the language of the imperial government. The Eastern Mediterranean provinces, which were always the most populous, are booming and prosperous and wealthy and interconnected. The Roman Empire still controls the entire eastern half of its former territory. And under Justinian, who was a Westerner, whose native tongue is Latin, although he would have been was fluent in Greek, he has dreams of reconnecting the lost pieces of the Roman Empire. And throughout the 530s, these dreams are being realized. He manages through his military commander Belisarius to recapture the large and wealthy provinces of North Africa and reattaches them to the Roman Empire. And he's well on his way to reconquering Italy, to taking it back from the Goths. in the late 530s and early 540s, when disaster strikes and his plans are, to say the least, seriously altered by the course of natural events that he could never have foreseen. So the Roman Empire is different in the 6th century, and yet again, I think it's wrong of us to say that this had to be an empire in decline, or that this was really only a kind of small medieval Byzantine state. The Roman Empire of the early 6th century is still one of the most powerful states on the face of the earth.
And then let's take another snapshot. So 100 years on, say 650, something like that. What's the state of Rome in the West and in the East at that stage?
Well, I think we've come to appreciate through study of the historical sources as well as archaeology that the 7th century is probably a nadir. It's a bottoming out of levels of population. It is certainly the bottoming out of urbanism between antiquity and the Middle Ages, and it is probably the very apex of political fragmentation. And the Roman Empire has lost its largest and by far its most wealthy and populous provinces in the Near East. So it's lost Syria, it's lost Palestine, which were really heartlands of the Eastern Mediterranean, to the Islamic invasions. It's lost by then Egypt, and is in the process of losing the rest of North Africa, and will be really little more than a rump state that controls most of Anatolia and much of what's now Greece. So the Roman Empire itself is now so dramatically reduced that it's, in some sense, a different kind of political organism. In the West, the world is highly fragmented. Italy is a patchwork of Byzantine cities and Lombard duchies that lack centralization. The north of the Alps and in Gaul, the world is divided among Merovingian kings who have very limited authority. The British Isles are divided into relatively small scale Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So it's the height of political fragmentation. Trade absolutely never goes away. There's still always some linkages between these societies, but the amount of trade has drastically gone down, and particularly as towns became smaller, many of them never disappeared. Rome itself never, of course, ceases to be an important religious center, but it's lost its political centrality and it's lost its economic centrality. And so a city that in the 4th century still had well over 500,000 inhabitants has been reduced by an order of magnitude. We don't really know, but I think the best estimates are that the population of Rome is no more than 50,000. So what had been the center of a world is now a kind of small but religiously important city. So the world of the 7th century really is a kind of transition point between an ancient order and a medieval one, if we can use those to sort of describe the great complex transitions between an ancient urban integrated world and a medieval world that's divided between Islam, Byzantium, and the Germanic kingdoms in the West.
So let's go back as Gibbon did, because that's sort of given some snapshots showing the decline from 400. But what I'd like to do is go back in time to the time of the Antonines and to around the year 161. And that's the time of Marcus Aurelius, right? And he's one of the Antonine emperors, and maybe he's the most famous of them all. And that's absolutely the high point of the Roman Empire. So do you want to say a bit how things were at that point? You know, and you talk in your book, and it very much surprised me, was about just the background level of disease, which was there the whole time throughout the Roman Empire. and the health of the Roman Empire may be compared to places like Germany or other places like that, which were outside the empire. So do you want to say a bit about what conditions were like then, around about the time of Marcus Aurelius?
Sure. And in some ways, I think it's really cool that we still are influenced so much by Gibbon, who does famously argue that the 2nd century is the height of the empire. And not just that, in his words, it's the happiest period in the history of the human race. And well, we might want to qualify that. It captures something about the tempo of demographic and economic and political development under the Pax Romana. And in the middle of the 2nd century, in the age of the Antonines, when a lot of things go right, including the fact that a series of emperors don't have a natural son and are able to carefully select their successor, among other things that go right, political stability, continuity, conduces to this really extraordinary period of efflorescence, of population growth, when, at least for a time, it doesn't engender these kind of Malthusian overpopulation dynamics that so often affect pre-industrial societies. The Romans grow, and we can see signs of demographic increase all over the empire, but it's also a period when trade grows, when cities get bigger, when economic specialization is far more advanced than it had been. And ordinary people benefit from this, as well as, of course, the elites in the Roman Empire. And yet, while I very much believe that that's a fair characterization, I also think as we've paid more attention to what life was like in the Roman Empire, what it was like for ordinary people, for men, women, for people in the town, people in the country, for people at the center, for people at the periphery, we've developed a richer appreciation for the fact that the Romans were quite unhealthy. And in a comparative sense, that shouldn't surprise us. And I think it's one of the hardest things for us as modern historians to do is to empathize with the really basic biological circumstances that most of our human ancestors faced. We are very fortunate, even in the shadow of the COVID-19 pandemic, as residents, if we are privileged enough to live in the developed world, to live in societies where infectious disease have been brought under control for a variety of reasons, public health and biomedicine. We don't ordinarily fear that our lives are suddenly going to be cut short by the arrival of a plague or a pox. But that's a historically exceptional fact that's only characteristic of developed societies and only for the last 150 years, give or take. In pre-industrial societies, infectious diseases are always the leading cause of death, even in times where there isn't a mortality crisis brought on by a pestilence. The majority of people die from respiratory infections, whether chronic, like tuberculosis, or acute, like, say, in later times, measles, smallpox, but whooping cough, diphtheria. People die of diarrheal diseases that still today in the developing world are one of the most important causes of mortality, particularly for children. And when people in pre-industrial societies, they don't have modern sewage, they don't have modern water filtration and treatment. And so diarrhea, dysentery are serious burdens on human health. Ordinary parasites, what we think of as macroparasites like whipworm and hookworm, soil transmitted parasites, must have been extremely common, and there's growing archaeological evidence for that in pre-industrial societies, including very much the Roman Empire. In large parts of the empire, malaria was a major burden, as it was in parts of Europe down to the 19th century or so. So at some level, it's pretty unsurprising that the Romans are like every other pre-industrial society. They don't have biomedicine. They don't understand germ theory. They have rudimentary systems of public health. The cities do probably have a pretty good water supply, but they don't have anything to take the waste out of the city. So the Roman Empire, as it turns out, even by pre-industrial standards, looks like a pretty unhealthy place. The evidence for this is various, but one that's telling is that the Romans get shorter. That the peoples of the Iron Age and the peoples of the successor period of the Roman Empire achieve higher stature. They're physically taller. And in my view, one explanation for this is that the disease burden of the Roman Empire that was created by the very ecological conditions that we associate with Rome's flourishing, like urbanism and trade, were also very conducive to the spread of parasites. And I think the people in the Roman Empire, in a world where there wasn't strong biomedical or public health controls on infectious disease, bore the burden of this. And in some ways, I think that enriches the way we can think about the process of, or the experience of living under the Roman Empire, even at its height.
Something that puzzled me when I read your book, I read somewhere, I'm sure, that the entry qualification to the Roman Empire was 5'8". And I think from the femur lengths that you were quoting, it felt like that wouldn't allow for a very large army.
Right. I mean, that's a good question. And we don't know how strictly enforced those kinds of standards really were. But it's a good way to think about what are the expectations. And after all, 5'8" in the ancient world may have been kind of tall. It might not have. To us, that strikes us as average or even slightly below average for achieved male stature. But we're tall. I'm not, but we're talking averages here, and it's just a fact that human beings have gained over an inch over the last century in developed societies, and that's a standard. We don't know exactly how it was enforced, but I think the skeletal evidence can help give us a sense of the fact that may have been certainly not out of the ordinary. The average Roman male is somewhere in the 160s, 165 centimeters or so. So that gives us at least some sense of what that would have really meant in a society where a lot of people were stunted or had their physiological development impaired by the fact that they're fighting off parasites almost constantly in their childhood during the period of development.
I was very taken by your table on femur lengths. Well, I don't know if it was in the table or not, but you said somewhere in the book that in Roman Britain, if you look at the skeletons before the invasion and the skeletons after the invasion, they're much taller than they are during the period of the Roman occupation, which was completely surprising to me. Yeah,
that's an interesting study that British bioarchaeologists did at a site in Dorset. That's very interesting because there's a very continuous local record, which we don't always have for a variety of reasons. One, it's hard for bones to preserve, but furthermore, the Romans have the very annoying habit for bioarchaeology of cremating their dead, so it makes bones harder to preserve and find. But in this case, it's interesting because we do have they're practicing inhumation burial the whole time. So you have a very continuous record. You can watch the Romans come, and it's not good for the local population. And we don't really know why. I mean, there may have been property. This is an imperialism that affects the colonized in different ways. The Roman elites may have come and taken a lot of the land and forced people to kind of who were formerly independent landowners who have decent diets. The Romans may come, take a lot of their property, force them to work really hard. But a lot of it looks like it has to do with urbanization. What really happens is the Roman system expects there to be towns, and there's going to be big military camps. So you're going to have dense populations that are a reservoir of diseases, that are nodes and a network for the circulation of diseases. So I don't think that's the only dimension of changing health, but I do think it's a big one. And that's a great sample because it's so continuous. But there are now a growing number of studies that explore some of the nuances of this picture, but really have, I think, confirmed the overall story that people in the Roman period look more physiologically stressed and shorter than the people of the Iron Age or the people of the early Middle Ages. And there are other methodological challenges here too. And one that I think is really hard is a lot of the study comes from Italy, and you have Lombards migrating, to put it mildly, into Italy. And so some of these skeletons may be German people. And there's a lot of complexity to this, but it does seem like people in the early Middle Ages, the towns have shrunk. There's fewer people because of plague. And so the people who are there have more land. When there's more land, one of the things that's very, very well understood from these pre-industrial societies is when people are richer and they have more land, one of the first things they're going to do is eat meat. People like meat, and meat is fairly land intensive and to produce. And so in periods of depopulation, there's more land, there's more cows, and people are eating more meat. And so they have more protein. And the macronutrients that the human body gets from eating meat is very conducive to growth. So one thing that's simply happening by the 6th and 7th century is there's more cows per person, more meat per person, people are bigger. But I think that's a pretty cool way to look at human and environmental history.
And then you give the other example of Marcus Aurelius's family. And he has, I can't remember how many children, 7 children with his wife.
We know of 14 live births, which is amazing. And it, it's small sample size. It's not demographically representative, but it's powerful because we know something about these people. And it reminds us that infectious diseases, while sometimes they do affect the poor more strongly than people who are affluent, there's no doubt that people who are deprived of good nutrition, people who are stressed, will have worse outcomes in the case of infection. But there's also a very strong sense in which infectious diseases are not respecters of persons. They can be very indiscriminate. And obviously, Marcus Aurelius and his wife Faustina had every element of wealth and privilege a human being can have, and it really didn't protect them. And we don't understand very well exactly what happened. There could have been genetic dimensions, but clearly several of the children die of infectious disease, and it's just a reminder of how fragile humans were, even humans who had great social advantages. And that's true really down at least to the 17th century. And you can look at the Stuart royal family that's utterly decimated by infectious disease, and particularly smallpox. And there's I think something that helps us understand how desperately helpless some of these pre-modern societies were by looking at these families that we know a little bit about and seeing that even the emperor suffered from the disease environment. And ultimately, he only has 2 children that certainly survive him out of the 14 that were born.
That's extraordinary. So Marcus Aurelius, he does what the Romans like to do from time to time. I don't know why he does it, but they decide to invade Persia, and it goes very well. But then supposedly, and I think you don't agree with this, but the Romans think that they make a blunder when they besiege and capture a particular city. So do you want to say a bit about that story and the outcome and what you think really happened?
So we sometimes forget that Marcus Aurelius, during the first 5 years of his reign, shares power with his adoptive brother Lucius Verus, and for a variety of reasons, but one of them being, yes, just as you kind of imply, the Romans view it as a duty to invade Parthia periodically, although Americans seem to have the same bad habit. But the Emperor Lucius leads a very significant campaign into the Tigris Valley and is quite successful, as you say. And the troops, when they reach the city of Seleucia on the Tigris, which was one of the really great cities of ancient Parthia, would have compared with Alexandria or Antioch, a major trading city. So this is not a little village that they're capturing. And the troops allegedly desecrate a temple of Apollo. It's a partly Hellenized city, and there's a temple of Apollo in the city. And when they do, they're said to open a casket that lets out a vapor. And the ancients believe that Apollo is the god of plague, and they believe that plagues are caused by miasma or pollution of the atmosphere. And so they believe that this is the origins of a pandemic, of a very large scale epidemic or very large scale disease outbreak in the later 160s. And I think there are probably threads of that story that are true, that maybe when the Roman armies were in Parthia, that there was a pestilence. And it's very possible that Roman armies who are returning to their military camps all around the empire, the legions had been sort of concentrated in the east for this campaign, and then they're dispersed back around the frontiers, and would have been a very effective vehicle for the rapid and very widespread transmission of the disease. At the same time, I think that we can have some skepticism about this story. For one thing, it comes down to us in traditions that are eager to blacken the memory of Lucius Verus and one of his associates named Avidius Cassius, who ultimately rebels against Marcus Aurelius. So they go down in history as bad guys. And it's a little unsurprising that their tarnished reputations get fixed to this disease outbreak and divine judgment from Apollo. For another thing, the plague seems to be inside the Roman Empire, if the dating of one of our other sources is correct, a year before they sack the temple of Apollo. So that creates a little bit of a giveaway there. But then I think really interesting to me from the perspective of global history is in the middle of the 150s, so a full decade before these events, there is a Sabaic inscription in Arabia, in Yemen, that reports a deadly pestilence that had wiped through the land. And to me, of course, we don't know with certainty whether we can connect these dots. That's always one of the challenges of ancient history. But to me, it seems like good circumstantial evidence that we can see the movement of this disease outbreak on the borders of the Roman Empire. And so maybe it moves through Arabia. Maybe it does move up the Red Sea into the Roman Empire. Maybe it also spreads up the Persian Gulf, since there are very extensive trading networks connecting the Indian Ocean, East Africa, Arabia, and the Persian Gulf. And so maybe we can just, with these dots, cautiously infer that we can connect some of them and see this as a bigger disease event. But certainly once it reaches the Roman Empire, it is bigger and faster than any disease event in the historical record of the Romans, which is pretty good. We have lots of indications of epidemics, and mortality would have gone up and down. But there's really nothing like this, where we have source after source. We have inscriptions from all over the empire that are reflective of this terrific disease outbreak. So once it does start to spread, wherever it comes from, however it does start, we can say with a little more certainty that it moves very far, very fast, and is a quite exceptional kind of mortality event in terms of the way the Romans perceive it and in terms of reality.
So a few questions just piling on themselves. First of all, what do you think the disease is? How many people die, and how long is it before it finally goes away?
I don't know, and I don't know, but that's not going to stop.
I'll cut that bit out.
We would love to know the biological agent. We don't know it until we have the DNA of the pathogen. If it is a DNA organism, RNA viruses like coronavirus, can be responsible for pandemics. And so far, it is impossible to find RNA pathogens very reliably. People aren't actually looking that are that old. So it's very possible we'll never know. But most historians who've worked on it have thought smallpox. There are problems with that. Smallpox is a virus, and we now believe that all strains of modern smallpox that we kind of know from the modern historical record are really not very old. So only go back to the 16th or 17th century. So it couldn't have been exactly modern variola major. And that was sort of where things were even 4 years ago when I wrote the book, almost 5 years ago. And the world is moving fast. The world of paleogenomics, of the study of the evolutionary history of pathogens, and even a lot has happened since then. Very interestingly, just less than a year ago, a team of scientists published early medieval ancestral smallpox. So even though modern smallpox is very recent and descends from a common ancestor that's only 300 or 400 years old, some kind of smallpox, and we don't even really have a good way of talking about what are extinct lineages of pathogens that are closely related to modern ones that we know of. But there were extinct branches of the smallpox family tree. It's variola major from the maybe 7th, 8th, 9th centuries in Northern Europe that killed people. That's not exactly the same as modern smallpox, but is very, very similar. So the disease would have been very similar, although we can't ever know without complete genetic identity that it would have had exactly the same features as modern smallpox. But this is cool because it tells us that some kind of smallpox was out there a long time ago. It also lets us estimate when all of the smallpox viruses that we know, including modern as well as these ancestral smallpox, evolved. And the scientists have estimated something like 1,700 years ago, which is very interesting for a student of the Antonine Plague, because that estimate puts it right within the range of this historical event. And so if you twisted my arm, I would say the most likely suspect that I can point to is a kind of ancestral smallpox that may belong to a now extinct lineage, but we don't know what disease it was. We can only go on the descriptions of the great 2nd century physician Galen, and his descriptions of it are intriguing. They've often suggested smallpox, but it's, as I say, not absolutely certain. So that's the first question. How many people did it kill? Well, in an ancient empire, we don't have the kind of government mortality records that let us say with certainty. In the Roman case, we don't even have the kind of records that we have from the late Middle Ages that let us, in the case of the Black Death, have some really, really credible, detailed insights into the mortality record. So people have tried to get around this in a variety of ways by looking at other kinds of proxy for population levels. And while those are often very suggestive of major demographic decline, very sudden demographic decline, they're proxy records. And so that doesn't mean that the plague did it. And it also could be the case that political changes account for some of the decline in the proxy record. So consequently, the range of estimates has varied enormously from 2% to 30%. I don't find either of those to be very likely, but I think the mortality was very high in urbanized areas of the empire. This was probably a human-to-human, directly communicable disease, which means it would have been worse in the cities than in the countryside. There do seem to be major ruptures in the 2nd century that I think are best explained by a demographic shock. But still, I think I've said, if you make me choose, maybe 10% of the empire worse in a lot of places, much lighter in a lot of places. But still, that's 7 to 8 million people just snuffed out by the spread of a disease very suddenly. And so That was your second question. And now I've gone on so long, I forgot your third question. What was it?
When does the Antonine Plague sort of die out?
Yeah. And this is another reason why it looks like a directly communicable disease that probably confers resistance like smallpox does. Although many acute respiratory viruses confer quite a degree of resistance. But one of the patterns is that it strikes very suddenly, then it goes away, then it comes back 15 years later, which may suggest that the susceptible population who didn't have immunity or didn't have resistance to the disease from previous exposure had grown again. But we know of really a kind of series of outbreaks that, again, with the kind of evidence we have, it could be some totally other disease if you're very skeptical of connecting dots, or it could be this pestilence kind of rumbling around, ricocheting around the empire. And as populations return without immunity, they get struck. And so there's a major outbreak in 192 in Rome that's possibly the same disease. But then after that, it seems to abate, and it's much harder to find evidence for major outbreaks at the very end of the 2nd century and for the first half of the 3rd century. So that's something that's a bit mysterious, but insofar as the written record is reflective, it seems that it bounces around the Roman Empire in these kind of waves of secondary outbreaks, and then seems to dissipate, relent, maybe leave the Roman Empire. This is one of the problems. If it's smallpox, where does it go? And we don't really understand that.
I think you date there's something called the crises of the 3rd century. And I think you date that slightly later than some people do, or at any rate, you rate the Severan emperors pretty highly. And then you come to the reign of Philip the Arab. And I think everybody would agree that once Philip the Arab is assassinated, there's at least 20 or 30 years of complete chaos. And around about the same time as that's happening, there's the plague of Cyprian. And do you connect the chaos of the 3rd century with that disease, or are these just events that happen to be occurring at the same time?
Right. No, I think there are certainly some causal connections. And there's a lot of unknowns about this period, so I won't belabor that point. But I'll start with where you started. That, of course, the 25 years or so from 250 to 275, roughly, are very troubled. And it's a classic historical problem. To what extent do we see the decades leading down to that as a kind of inevitable movement in that direction that laid the scene for the crisis? And to what extent do we see the crisis happening at the very specific conjuncture of historical events in, say, the 240s, 250s? And those are ends of a spectrum. Even I think that there were building structural problems in the first half of the 3rd century, geopolitically, fiscally. So the crisis doesn't come out of nowhere. But at the same time, I think we have to be cautious, because you could go back to the Antonines, the 2nd century, the Golden Age. The Romans, they lose border skirmishes. They decrease the precious metal content of the coinage. A lot of the things that happened in the 3rd century, not to the same extent, are going on in the 2nd century. So I don't see the 3rd century crisis as the sort of totally predictable, inevitable outcome of long-standing structural tensions. I think it took both the buildup of structural problems and the rather sudden shocks from environmental change. The 240s seem to have experienced some kinds of sudden climate change, and then hot on the heels of that comes another very widely documented outbreak of a pandemic disease that we call the Plague of Cyprian, that starts, and this is a little fuzzy, but seems to reach the Roman Empire around 250, a year or two before or after. And the sources say it lasts for 15 years, which again could sort of mean that it ricochets around. We really have no idea what the microbe that causes it was. It's even harder than the Antonine Plague to guess. And it's been a little neglected for whatever reason by modern historians, but it's quite prominent in the historical sources that we have. And particularly if you're paying attention to the patterns of infectious disease, like I said, there are no major pandemics between 200 and 250. I mean, if you want to find one, you can't. And then all of a sudden we have, I think it's 7 or 8 eyewitness records and 24 more or other in total in the historical record that tell us there was this very sudden, widespread, and deadly disease event. So I think we have to include that in our story of the crisis, where the coinage system collapses, the military frontier system is broken along both the northern and eastern frontiers. The always somewhat fragile system of imperial legitimacy just completely melts down, and the empire breaks apart. I think in some ways the Roman Empire could have really fundamentally split in the middle of the 3rd century, but it doesn't. It's put back together. But the demographic shock is a fundamental ingredient in the military, fiscal, constitutional crisis of that generation. And the sources, the human witnesses tell us so. I mean, I think some of it's basic empathy and listening to what those who experienced it have to tell us.
You said that it doesn't fall apart and it recovers. And when I read your book, I think, hey, it's actually doing pretty well. The population is recovering. They seem to have got the economy under some kind of control. Things seem to be going pretty well. And then we have barbarian invasion. And we have, in particular, sorry to leap so far ahead, but we have the Battle of Adrianople, which is sort of felt, I think, by most historians to be a crucial event in the military history of the empire. And yet when I look at your book, I see, well, it was a catastrophe because it wiped out the Eastern field army and maybe 20,000 soldiers are killed. And I'm thinking, well, if you go back to the days of the Roman Republic, they could lose 2 or 3 times that in an afternoon when fighting the Carthaginians. And it's just Italy. And it's just central Italy, in fact. And yet the entire Roman Empire can't cope with the loss of 20,000 men. And I just struggle to understand why that was such an important event militarily, given that fact.
You're on to some very profound questions about the geopolitical dynamics of the late Roman Empire and its fiscal and demographic underpinnings. And clearly there was a kind of fragility there that made this such an impactful military loss. And it's an interesting thought experiment to compare it with the late Republic, where you do have a society that's in some ways very different, because it's a kind of mass military mobilization society in the context of late Republic and Italy that's fighting, in the case of the Second Punic War, virtually a kind of ancient equivalent of total war, where mobilization is so thorough. And you just think if the late Roman Empire could have only done that. But obviously they didn't and couldn't. And so the historical circumstances that aligned in late Republican Italy during the conquest period are quite exceptional. And in some ways, the later Roman period is closer to the historical norm, when empires do often struggle to maintain what seems sometimes like relatively modest military levels. And the late Roman army is big, but its obligation to defend territory is so massive, and almost the shape of the Roman Empire is itself unstable. And I think it's worth pointing out that only once in history does a political configuration that stretches from Britain to Palestine take shape. And the 4th century empire is trying to hold on to it because of the legacy of the shape of the Roman Empire. But it's circumstances are quite different, starting with the fact that the enemies across the frontier are more ferocious, certainly more organized, and more formidable. And it makes it hard for a military that's spread thinly over a frontier to keep them out when they want to get in. And the field army was particularly important for kind of mobile reinforcement of Roman power along the frontiers. And when that was wiped out, it's sort of like the kind of heavy weaponry that had to move around behind a pretty thin frontier line was seriously debilitated. And then there's, of course, just the symbolic impact of these kinds of military defeats that proved that the force of the Roman emperor himself was defeatable. So that'd be my best take at it, but it's, I think you're really on to a hard question.
When we started our discussion, we were at the year 400, which we're moving back up to, I guess. And they do recover sort of from Adrianople. They sort of stabilize things. They start to import the barbarians into the army, and that's not going too badly. But then they're hit with this wave of invasion after invasion. And I think you suggest that there's a climate source to this problem for them.
Yeah, I mean, at a high level, it's certainly plausible that mass human migrations are driven by climate and subsistence crises, and this is true today in a world where systems of food production are far more resilient than in the ancient world. We're still one of the main effects of climate change and of short-term climate variability is migration. And humans are vulnerable to environmental changes. Refugee crises are one of the consequences of that. And so it's at a high level, it's certainly plausible that we can partly understand the movements of the 4th and 5th century in terms of the possibility of changing climates. And it's hard because we don't have very much testimony from the people themselves who move, whether we're talking about Germanic peoples who are developing their identity and culture in important ways in this period, or whether we're talking about Central Asian peoples like the Huns, who the Roman sources insist are one of the driving forces between the later 4th to the mid 5th century, that this nomadic Central Asian steppe population is one of the really driving forces in the domino effect of human movements into Europe. And so I think that's a very plausible story. I think there's archaeology can enrich the limited human sources, but I think it has a kind of plausibility to argue that the changes in the climate may have been one of the driving factors that either motivate Hunnic migration or as well Germanic migration.
I think you said in the book that there was a drying of the climate out sort of around about the area of China, and that this was one of the motivations for people who are horse-based to move. Did I understand that right?
Yeah, and the Huns are fascinating and mysterious, partly because we don't really know that much about them. In the middle of the 4th century, they show up in the Roman sources very suddenly and prominently. And there are lots of debates about who they are, to what extent even is the name of the Huns linguistically the same as the Xiongnu, who are the main nomadic confederation across from China, and even beyond whether the name is the same, the vastly harder question of, is this the same people or is it the same political confederation? Just think of the name Roman. It becomes pretty flexible, used for over 1,000 years by people speaking very different languages and living in different parts of the world. So we would love to know really what it means when we're told that the Huns show up in force in the 370s. But one of the cool new layers of our knowledge about this part of the past is that we can start to piece together what the climate's doing, largely from tree rings. And it does seem like there's a period of massive drought in the steppe in the middle of the 4th century. So, it's up to us to decide whether or not we can or should connect the dots. But it does seem like there's a very strong signal of what would have been a massive environmental challenge that coincides with our historical record for major population movements. And we're, I think, still at the beginning of trying to understand whether and how those are all connected.
Okay, so let's skip forward as we did before, because we know that there was the collapse in, don't know exactly when you say 410 or where exactly you would date the end of the Western Empire, whether it's 476 or that's the traditional date, or whether it's somewhat earlier or maybe somewhat later. So the empire under Justinian, and he takes over, and he's enormously energetic. He decides to codify the whole of Roman law, the entire history of Roman law, which is an amazing project and undertaking. He sets out to reconquer the Western provinces, which he does successfully, at least in Africa, and partially successfully in Italy. And then he's undercut by something which I had no idea even existed. So do you want to say a bit about the plague under the time of Justinian? Because it made I was just astonished by what I read.
Well, I think that this is the single most important environmental or biological event in all of antiquity. And the warrant for that kind of claim starts with the human testimony. And we have a variety of sources with very different cultural backgrounds, very different worldviews, who are univocal in describing what happened as a plague that was unlike anything within human memory. And they describe in great detail the course of the plague into the Roman Empire, and then throughout, particularly the Eastern Roman Empire, culminating in its appearance in Constantinople, the capital where Justinian was, in the spring of 542. We call this the Plague of Justinian, after the emperor, and that name describes an outbreak of infectious disease that stretches from 541 into the mid or late 540s. It is the first outbreak of what we call more broadly the first plague pandemic, which is a period of 200 years during which this same disease repeatedly breaks out, sometimes on smaller scales, sometimes on bigger scales. And our ancient written sources describe the course of the infection, and they describe the very classic symptom of bubonic plague, which is the appearance of large swollen balls or protrusions of hardened pus in the human lymph node that are caused by bacterial infection with the bacterium Yersinia pestis. So in English, when we say the plague, we sometimes mean it generically, like the Antonine plague, which is a pestilence of an unknown disease. When we say the plague, we sometimes in English mean the plague, meaning the specific bacterial infection caused by Yersinia pestis. This is indisputably the cause of the Black Death in the 14th century, and more broadly, the second plague pandemic that outbreak inaugurates. And the Justinianic plague is also now, we can say with absolute certainty, caused by this bacterial agent. We, historians, had strongly suspected that because of the description of the disease in our sources. And it is now confirmed by archaeological DNA of the bacterium itself that has been recovered from victims who died of the disease and whose skeletons, whose teeth, whose tooth enamel provided a little cavity where a fleck of the person's blood was preserved over 1,500 years. And in that blood was found by archaeogeneticists, people who specialize in the retrieval and sequencing and validation of ancient DNA, was found the DNA of the killer, the bacterium Yersinia pestis. So it's a really amazing conjunction of human history and human sources and scientific history and laboratory-derived evidence that help us understand this event and to enrich what we can say about it in a variety of ways, but just starting with what is now confidence of what it was and knowing that it was the same pathogen that caused the Black Death, which I think we can all agree was a pretty extraordinary historical shock. And in my view, the evidence that we have points to a same kind of crisis in the middle of the 6th century.
Yes, so Justinian, he doesn't just have to put up with the plague, which wipes out what? I think you said you think 50 or 60%?
Well, I could say a lot and would still end up in a place of uncertainty. But look first at Constantinople, which is the only place where we have really good descriptions. And one of our eyewitnesses who was there and who's given us a very vivid description, that doesn't mean that he couldn't exaggerate, but he tells us that they counted the bodies until it was at 230,000. And that really he thought that the final number of dead in Constantinople was over 300,000. Now, ancient numbers are always, guilty until proven innocent. But what's amazing is our estimates for the size of Constantinople are about 500,000. So that would be 50, 60% of the population, which is what the Black Death does in much, much better attested contexts where we have a lot more evidence and a lot more confidence. So that's one tiny indication. And we would love to know more, but we don't. What we do now know is really that the plague spread far and wide. And to me, as a historian, this was actually the really hard question, because the sources for Constantinople, we can always find ways to deny what the historical evidence plainly tells us if we're set on it. But if the record for Constantinople is, to me, very compelling. What we really, really didn't know is how far did this manage to go? Could it really spread into the West, into the countryside? And we don't have much evidence. For Italy, we know about the Justinianic plague from one chronicle. And it just says the plague was a great mortality in Italy. What do you make of that? Does that mean half the population died, or does that mean that it was, a scary disease in Rome and Ravenna, where our human observers are most likely to care about? So what's happened just in the last year is more archaeological DNA. And it's coming from all over Western Europe, from Germany, France, Spain, and including now one 6th century site in England, in Cambridgeshire, at a site called Edic's Hill that was a small Anglo-Saxon hamlet, thought to have been home to 50, 60 something people. We're not talking about Constantinople here. It got there. The people were buried in the middle of the 6th century at Edic's Hill, in the absolute boondocks of Cambridgeshire, died of this plague that our sources in Constantinople tell us killed over 300,000 people, so overwhelmed the systems of burial that they had to start digging pits and then finally stacking the bodies in giant towers. We now know that same that germ made it to the Atlantic Ocean and to little societies. So we're starting to fill in these vast blank spots in our knowledge with this new kind of scientific evidence. And I think it's very compelling evidence for the impact of this disease event.
And then they have the double hit, don't they? Because the climate changes violently against them around about the same time.
Yeah, can't catch a break. And there may be some deeper connection between these two events, but it's now very, very clear signal in the paleoclimate record, particularly in the form of tree rings, including series from Europe, from the Alps, as well as from Central Asia, from the Altai Mountains, that can be harmonized to create a picture of northern hemispheric scale climate patterns. And it is very evident that the 530s and 540s are the coldest decades of the late Holocene. So,
sorry, what is the Holocene?
The late Holocene, the last 2,500 years or so, say, which is the records are at that level of detail are only about 2,500 years old in this case. So you're talking about the coldest period over a series of thousands of years, and very sudden cooling that is induced by not one, but a sequence of volcanic eruptions that ultimately cough clouds of sulfur that aerosolize in the atmosphere and reflect or scatter solar radiation. And so kind of cool the surface of the earth. And for people living through it, this was a crisis in its own. It caused harvests to fail. It shortened the growing season. It reduced agricultural productivity. And this happens in kind of geological perspective right at the same moment as the plague. And so whether they're causally connected or whether simply they were simultaneous environmental crises, the people living through it would have experienced these dual environmental shocks in a way that would have profoundly affected their lives. And that's what the historical record tells us.
It's quite terrifying that, because although we could probably cope with the plague better with modern medicine, I hope, I don't know what we could do about massive volcanic eruptions cooling our climate. That could be catastrophic.
Right. Well, not to get too far off, but the human driven climate change is our concern. But we can certainly, I think, learn from history that human societies are very sensitive to climate change on different scales. And the Roman example is one case of that.
And you said that the temperatures fell by, on average, 2.5 degrees. And I'm never very sure when I hear about climate change, how bad that is. So do you want to just say? That's
a lot. A change of average temperature of 2 to 2.5 degrees is really, you would notice. That's a really big change in the experience of the climate, particularly for a farming society where most people live directly on the land and depend on patterns of temperature and precipitation for their immediate livelihood.
So the empire presumably is massively weakened just demographically by both the plague and by the climate issues, and presumably lots of things that were working just don't work anymore because there's nobody there to make them work, right? So the Persians decide this is their moment for revenge, and I'm sort of coming back up into the 600s now after Justinian. So do you want to just explain about how the Persians managed to, effectively conquer the whole of the Roman Empire? Then the Romans strike back, but anyway.
The Persian Empire is a pretty formidable enemy, and the the enmity between the Romans and the Persians is cyclical from the middle of the 3rd century right down to the end, which is the end is the 630s, when Arab armies show up and put the Romans and the Persians both out of business. But the wars with Persia were one of the sort of ongoing structural geopolitical problems faced by the Romans, very much by Justinian, who had ambitious plans and then tries to just sort of backstop his Persian problem while he takes over the Western Mediterranean. So there's always sort of tension with Persia, sometimes Cold War, sometimes hot war, and the Persians are no small enemy. And the Roman Empire, we don't know how much the Persian Empire was affected by this. We know it was hit by the plague. We wish we knew more. So it's hard to say whether the relative demographic impact is significant. But we do know that the demographic impact in the Roman Empire is significant. The Roman historians tell us it made it harder to conscript armies, particularly given that Justinian was already on this kind of mad campaign of reconquest, and they're trying to hold down enemies on multiple fronts in Africa. They're struggling to take back Italy, and then soon they have new enemies come across the Alps in Italy. The Balkans are challenged by invasions of peoples that the sources call Avars in the middle of the 6th century. So Rome's military challenges are multi-front, and in some ways it's maybe not surprising that they struggle to field a sufficient number of troops, and they're paying barbarians, as Romans have done for centuries, to try and fill in the biggest gaps. But as I put it, they're playing chess without enough pieces, and you can move around what you've got on the board for a while. But eventually, if you've lost too much material, your foes are going to take advantage. And the Romans and the Persians do have a slug it all out war that goes on for the better part of 30 years in the first part of the 7th century. And Rome seems to be steadily kind of losing ground. And the Persians had several times successfully invaded Syria, taken parts of Syria, sacked Antioch. But now they take Palestine, they take Jerusalem. So they're cutting deeper into the soft tissue of the Roman Empire. And this really seems to exhaust the Roman state fiscally, militarily. And it's certainly got to be the case that these structural weaknesses help to explain the really sudden takeover of these ancient territories with such speed in the middle decades of the 7th century, from the 630s and 640s by the Arabs. It's really just astonishing that these deeply, deeply Romanized provinces, these highly advanced, urbanized, integrated regions of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt are so quickly and so fundamentally severed from the center of Roman power, and permanently.
I feel very sorry for Heraclius, because he seems to be one of the great Roman emperors in that, he's been pushed back to the walls of Constantinople, quite literally. There's pretty much nothing left, on the Asian side anyway of his empire, and he strikes back, and he actually comes out the winner in the war against Persia. I mean, how fair is that?
No, I think you're right. I mean, pretty extraordinary period, and he seems to have benefited from the help of foreign troops as well. But most of the later Roman emperors did, and again, it's a question of how do we make sure that hindsight isn't blinding us, and maybe the Romans could well have managed to reassert their power over the Eastern Mediterranean. I think it is possible to imagine an Eastern Mediterranean Roman state that still controls Egypt and Palestine and Syria, enduring for the long term. But it's one of the really critical facts that the military successes of Heraclius are then quickly undone in the following decades.
Okay, well, I think that's taken us up pretty much to the end of your book, and I guess it's taken us up pretty much to the end of the Roman Empire, though it carries on in some shape or form, but it's really the Byzantine Empire at this stage. It's a shrunken, smaller thing altogether, all the way up to 1400 and I can't remember.
53. They call themselves the Romaioi right to the end. So it's our choice if we call them something else. But I think you can thoughtfully make a case that by the time it loses most of its Eastern Empire, we're talking about a very different geopolitical being than the Roman Empire.
I do have one question to finish with. Is there any period where Professor Kyle Harper becomes Emperor of Rome, and maybe he's given a good shot at it, like Augustus was, like Justinian was, 20, 30 years on the throne? Could any of it have been changed by better rulership?
What a deep question. I would have probably done what Diocletian did and just retired to a beautiful seaside villa in the Adriatic and tended my garden. That's not a bad fate. But I think it does matter. You look at Marcus Aurelius, and he has some terrible luck, but I think there's some good reason why he's considered an effective emperor. He provides stabilizing leadership even in the midst of the crisis. He leads by example. He maintains a kind of social cohesion that was far from guaranteed. He's struggles on the northern frontier, but still is savvy enough to ensure that there's no permanent losses. So you look at his example and say maybe there's somebody who did help bring an empire out of a crisis that could have gone very differently. But ultimately, I think we look back on these societies and they didn't have the tools to respond to the environmental crises they faced. And we're very fortunate to have science and public health and the knowledge to respond in ways that are effective. Of course, we still are human beings, and as we've so vividly learned in this crisis, struggle to respond to surprises and to complex challenges that we face.
Yeah, maybe we shouldn't look down on the Romans too much, because the challenges that they faced were of a different order of magnitude to the ones that we are, perhaps struggling with slightly ourselves.
That's right.
Okay, well, I enjoyed the book enormously. It's The Fate of Rome. I think you said you have another book coming out?
I do. I'm working on a book that's a global history of infectious disease. I got really hooked on the challenge of trying to understand the history of disease and the way that human changes have affected the evolution of our pathogens, and the way that the evolution of our pathogens then influences the course of our own history. So trying to wrap that up, I've been working on it for years, and obviously it's become a little more relevant, unfortunately, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, but maybe it'll help give us a sense of the deeper story of how we got here.
Okay, well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me, Carl.
Very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Well, that's the end of today's show. I hope you enjoyed listening, and if you did, please do join me for future episodes. Goodbye for now.